Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. It's been a while. I was just telling my guest that since my smallest son, Mac, was born, this is my second podcast that I recorded in like 8 months. But as busy as I am with moving and things like that, when I had the opportunity to talk to my guest today, I had to jump on it because I really think she's doing important things. And I feel like a little bit of a hipster sometimes with some of the guests that I have on my podcast because I'm like, ooh, I get them before everyone else knows how awesome they are. So my guest today is Dr. Sheena Mason. She got her PhD from Howard University and then became a professor in African American literature at SUNY Oneonta, and then she has also taught at Cal Lutheran, William and Mary, and Howard. And then she developed the theory of racelessness. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We've been kind of acquaintances in similar circles and stuff like that. But the more I hear her talk, I am just impressed and I like it. And it's weird for someone like me to like it, I guess. But I'm really excited to have her here. Dr. Sheena Mason, thank you for being here. I'm very excited to talk to you, and I'm excited for you to share your ideas with my audience, which is a lot of different people from different across political spectrum and stuff, but also a lot of educators. So welcome. It's nice to see you. Can you just introduce yourself to our audience? Tell us a little bit about just like your background, and then we can get into the theory of racelessness because your book's coming out, and I really think I'm excited to read it and everything like that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Will. The feeling is mutual. I'm really excited because although we've only spent one panel discussion together, I've been following you as I've seen you being interviewed in different places regarding your perspective on CRT. That tends to be how I have engaged with some of your ideas consistently. And of course, I'm always happy to talk about my own because we're all self-centered in some ways. But more than that, I really see the theory of racelessness as giving more people what they say they want. And so I'm happy to delve in. Now, how did I get here? Well, I've always been interested in learning how race gets essentialized in American life and why. And even as an undergraduate, I was like deep in research for an advanced honors thesis that led me to work to understand this idea of representation as it gets applied to people who are racialized as Black. In other words, the idea that any single racialized Black person represents all racialized Black people, but then the double standard of that's only true if the person fits into the racist image of what it is to be Black. But if it's, a Barack Obama or something, they're the exception to the rule, right? I wanted to understand that. And I wanted to understand this idea too, this connected idea that there's an authentic way to be Black. And going down that path, I will say I always intended to get a PhD, but I didn't have the good fortune of getting degree after degree after degree. I had to work in between, so I lived a bit. I was a Teach for America Corps member in 2012 in Houston, Texas. I taught 9th through 12th grade English language arts at a last chance charter school. My passion for helping young people and the reason why I pursued Teach for America is because I knew, although I wanted to do the academic scholarly thing, get the PhD, publish and all of that, my end objective was to have a youth center in an underserved community. And so I was kind of building all the skills that I imagined would be required to do such an endeavor. And that took me to work for a fitness company called 24 Hour Fitness. I worked my way up the ranks. I lived in 6 different states for them, ending my career as a general manager in San Jose, California. I had a team of just under 100 employees, and I took advantage of the opportunities at 24 because if I wanted to be a business owner of sorts, even if it was a nonprofit, I wanted to know what I was doing, right? Yeah. And what I really learned through that work is that my interest in race and my interest in how people see themselves and how they see other people, and what I learned in how to motivate and inspire people, it's really all interconnected. as you said, I left my career at 24 to go get my doctorate, which I did. I ended up passing with distinction, an honor reserved for less than 1% of humanities PhDs worldwide, an already small number. So that tells you something about how people received, the faculty received my work at my institution. And the dissertation that I wrote was my signature theory of racelessness. People hear the theory of racelessness, but somehow they highlight the racelessness part, and then they think it's only about what they perceive to be racelessness, but it's a theory, it's an entire framework for analyzing race and racism, much like the popular theory, critical race theory. And my work had nothing to do with critical race theory. It was not a response, it was not a counter, but it is a counter to the way that we've done race, up until this point. And it's just become more clear and more publicized, if you will, more in the mainstream, how we do race and how we talk about racism. And so it's just coincidental that I happened to graduate at the time that I did, that I happened to have this theory of racelessness, which was inspired by my understanding that in African American literary studies, what I came to find was true, but often unspoken and unacknowledged, is that what the writers show us more often than not is that to undo racism, we have to undo our belief in race. And that's really what was the genesis for my work and this thing that I call the theory of racelessness. And then as my business theory of racelessness, I work to teach people about this, right? To teach people the core tenets of the theory and to teach people the philosophies of race that get untaught and therefore very much misunderstood. That's why I've seen people resist some of your ideas. You've kind of accidentally adopted some uncommon philosophies of race, and people misunderstand that because they don't have the language, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the history of these other philosophies. So I'm working to intervene and help people come together in ways that we're precluded from doing because race ideology continues to operate in the ways that it does.
Wow. Yeah. You mentioned something about how you view yourself matters and identity. And one of the things that I've learned doing just over 100 podcasts with very, very diverse people, all kinds, all over the place. I've had 6 different transgender people from across the political spectrum on here, for example, and stuff like, but it's like that with like kind of everything I can do, is how you identify matters. How you see yourself really matters, because I've had trans activists who see themselves as a trans activist. And then I've had trans individuals like Corinna Cohn who see themselves as computer programmers and cat lovers. And it really matters about how they attach their identity to these ideas and things like that. So that really resonates with me. You mentioned like the stuff that I'm doing. I've been on Black News Tonight with Mark Lamont Hill, but also on like Glenn Beck's show and Fox News and stuff like that with the CRT stuff. And I had a kind of Instagram live conversation. I don't know if you saw it, with 3 critical race theory educators. So
that was rough.
It didn't go well, and I really wanted that to go viral, not because I want to be Insta famous, but because I think it shows a lot of problems with what's going on. But I look like the enemy, Sheena. Like I am a wasp. I'm white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, heterosexual male, over 6 feet tall, like, rugged good looks. I got all this stuff. I'm like, so when I talk about like, let's get over the race stuff, or let's, all that kind of stuff, it really comes off bad to a lot of people.
It's not because of how you look. It has nothing to do. Okay, so it definitely appears that way because that's how race ideology sort of camouflages itself. But I don't get any, I don't get treated differently because my skin color and because people would racialize me as Black. I'm still saying some of the similar things. Some of the critiques that you have, or like even, like in the Instagram interview, if we can call it an interview, in that conversation, some of your critiques really came through the form of questioning and like asking for definitions and just asking questions. And you were met with such resistance largely because not because you are optically a white man, but because you're questioning the mainstream narrative. You're questioning what people presume is right and just, and the only way to not be racist or be against racism. And by questioning, you get lambasted as being wrong, being racist, and then then it can default to the conversation about, oh, well, you're a white man, so of course you think this. But it has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with the fact that, as I was saying earlier, we are not taught to think differently about this thing, the thing being racism. And because we're not taught a different way, everything else that kind of goes against that one way of seeing the problem and addressing the problem is met with resistance. And I've simply mastered, increasingly, I'm not perfect at this yet, but I've simply mastered how to communicate my ideas about racelessness, and particularly my theory, in a way that is often, but not always, met with less resistance. And when I say less resistance, that doesn't mean people just eat it up right away. They're not like, oh yeah, racelessness, championing it everywhere. No, people go at different speeds, and usually it has to do with their political leanings, not their skin color. But I do find that the way that I've been able to articulate my ideas opens the door to more people than how I've seen you circulating and other people circulating who are against CRT, or the sort of critical race theory way of doing things, but who don't necessarily yet have the language or don't have the toolkit to convey their ideas in a way that is received well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think that's bringing it to my attention, because if I had been a black man or a black woman or a black trans woman or something like that, but speaking it, then sometimes it's even worse. Then I would get called a whole slew of different names if I'm going against it, which I see happen all the time. I've seen it happen to you and things like that. That makes sense to me. Like, how do we? Okay, so can you maybe articulate a little bit about, like, how do we, if the goal is to get rid of race, because if you can't have racism without focusing on race, which we know is a social construct, how do we do this? This is the question you get constantly, nonstop, which is, you already know, like, how is that not ignoring the very real, horrific atrocities of the past, and how those even manifest in the current situation in America? When you look at the achievement gap in education, I didn't know that you were an educator. That's awesome. And you look at, like, the discrepancies in wealth and all that kind of stuff. That's all very real. So how do you not address that? And is it just through socioeconomic stuff like that? That's essentially where my question is like, for my audience, is is this not just dusting it under the rug? Because I think that there's a lot of people that would say, like, this is just trying to ignore the problem type of thing.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, they don't say that about my work. If the theory of racelessness, the company, is a place people go to free themselves from racism, then the presumption is that racism exists. It's a thing. If the theory of racelessness through education and academia and that sort of aspect of society is a framework for analyzing race and racism, again, you would have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to argue, oh, Sheena Mason, with her theory of racelessness, is trying to ignore the existence or the history of racism. No. So let's start there, right? Out of the gate, if you are not misunderstanding any aspect of what I'm saying, you will hear me say that racism exists, race does not. And the race does not is different from what you just said and what most people think. And this is where I think it can be enlightening for some people. There's a naturalist belief in race, which is a belief that race is biological. there's a constructionist belief in race, which is what you just spoke to, this idea that, okay, might not be biological, but we look at phenotype, we look at biology, ancestry, DNA, we translate that into something, and that makes race a social construction. And then there's where I am, which is a racial skeptic, which means that I say race doesn't exist, full stop. There's no race doesn't exist, but people pretend like it does exist, and so therefore it exists. That's what constructionists say, which is kind of illogic if you interrogate that. I say that race doesn't exist at all. Why? Well, my skepticism tells me that, okay, race isn't it's not biological. I believe modern scientists who have shown that to us time and again. And the things that people point to and say that's race or racial, they're misnaming other things, and like they're ethnicity? Just calling it like ethnicity. Yeah. Absolutely. Like culture. And those distinctions matter. People might be inclined to say, well, how is this just not semantics? Well, it matters, because if we translate ethnicity and culture into race, what happens is we're precluded from seeing all of the differences within the racial groups. And we're precluded from seeing similarities too, in ways that make us seem more dissimilar than not. And this is especially crucial in American society, where because of our history, as messy as it was, a bunch of different ethnicities came together and they create America, and then they are America. And all of those ethnicities and all of the cultures that those different ethnicities brought to the table, they became intermixed, so that it's no longer English culture that's American, right? Or Dutch or Irish or any place in West Africa, right? It's none of those cultures. You can't recognize the cultures if you go and compare it to British culture, for example. And so something new is created ethnically and culturally. But because we insist on racializing how we think of both ethnicity and culture, we continue to stay in the quagmire. And that's exactly how we stay divided across time, because we're taught and really programmed to see ourselves through the prism of race. So I work to help people stop mistranslating ethnicity or culture into race. And similarly, social and economic class gets mistranslated into race. There's this idea that most racialized Black people are poor, for example, or that most racialized white people are rich. And that's not reality. And then also this is the super downside of allowing this mistranslation, and that is that racism itself, racist ideas about human beings, also gets mistranslated into race. That's where stereotyping, essentialization, and all of those things come into play. And so long as we continue to mistranslate and insist on the reality of race, we miss the fact that racism continues to hide its face as race. And that's a huge part as to why in American society we've been unable to really transcend this thing. And so my work, I help people become more clear-eyed and astute about what racism is and how it operates, but even probably more importantly, how do we unify, heal, and reconcile given the history and given the tenuousness? And one more concrete example I would like to give is, you mentioned the things like the wealth gap and the achievement gap. Well, there's some contention around, what is racism systemic now? What is that? How does it impact today's society? And depending on how you lean politically, you'll blame it on different things. There's this idea that sometimes I really think people are convinced all racialized Black people are poor, for example, but they'll blame it on the system of racism, that's the left, and the right will blame it on the inferiority of this thing called Black culture, right? But upon inspection, which almost none of us are ever encouraged to investigate, we come to find that something like 19.5% as of 2020 of racialized Black people live below the poverty line. We could talk about the wealth gap, but I think people hear wealth gap and automatically, again, conflate Blackness with poor. It's just not matching the actual reality. And if 19.5% of racialized Black people live below the poverty line, then that means the vast majority do not. And that has not always been the case. Arguably, closer to emancipation, right? Most racialized Black people were impoverished. But it's like the language we use to think about and talk about racism in 2022 has been stuck in time, as if it's still 1865, right? Right before Reconstruction and stuff like that. It's like the only way we catch up is to get outside of the Black and white ways of thinking about it and talking about it, because then we'll be encouraged to question everything. Whereas right now we're not. We just talk about, we have the lingo, we talk about the wealth gap, we talk about the achievement gap, which I think is also misleading, because there's it's fundamentally an economic discrepancy or disparity that's happening there, which again, if most racialized Black people aren't poor, why are we making that as evidence of racism? And even if you look at the number of people who are impoverished, racialized Black people comprise something like 20% of that number, 25% indigenous, 10% Asian, and 10% racialized white, and then a mixed bag. But even those numbers, so even the majority of racialized or of poor people are not racialized Black, and even those numbers are something to be questioned, because just because 10% of racialized white people comprise poor people, that says nothing about how many people are actually poor that are racialized as white, because we know the population of racialized white people is astronomical compared to any other population. So it's all misleading, and we can't really solve any of those problems, or any of the problems that have real material impacts, so long as we have an image in our mind that's racialized. So the theory of racelessness works to help people outside of the fishbowl into the ocean, so that they can really be more clear-eyed about what racism is, how does it still manifest in 2022, what progress has been made, and what policies will actually have an impact in the areas that people say they care about, but they have the wrong image of what that is in their minds. That was a lot.
It is a lot. Well, I wrote some stuff down. Do you remember during Hurricane Katrina, Wolf Blitzer, he said, the people here are so poor and they're so Black. And it was a slip. It was like a Freudian slip. Biden said it just like 2 years ago too. He said something like, poor kids can learn just as much as white kids can. And
right.
And it's a flub, but it is like essentially like a Freudian slip type of thing, where it's like these things are getting conflated so much. And there's problems with this, because you look at the achievement gap, you could say, look at how Nigerians are doing compared to African descendants of slavery, and there's a difference there. And you bring that up, and it gets or poverty, and you say, like, I think one of the poorest counties in the country is a white county in West Virginia. So like you bring these things up, and it bucks the narrative, as you said, and then that's why I think people get really angry, because I'm not actually trying to catch people. I'm really not. I'm trying to make sense of this, and I take people's ideas seriously. So even though Ibram Kendi won't talk to me or someone like that, like I would want to ask these kinds of questions, like, how do you round that square? Because if this is your idea, what about this and what about this? Like that seems very, very like a conflict to me that I really am struggling with. And essentially what I get, because some of those people do interact with me, is just like essentially don't ask that question or be quiet.
Yeah.
And it's so frustrating. Like I'm actually curious.
Yeah, it's and I found the most efficient way to overcome those kinds of barriers is to help people outside of the Black and white. It's the only way. Once we liberate ourselves from racism, which I spell with the word race in it, right, to signify what I'm talking about. Once we liberate ourselves from that, and again, everyone comes along at a different pace. It's deeply psychological, it's spiritual even. I've had people describe it. But once you're able to do that, that's primarily when you're able to ask these other questions. And you can't kind of like skip to the good part of trying to think more critically about these other aspects of society. Another example this is making me think of, when people start drilling down and asking questions about equity, I collaborate with this person who's a professor of education at a school in California, and she said, man, I mean, she's a professor in education, and she's the faculty director of their diversity, equity, inclusion office, apparently. And she said it's a complete nightmare for her because they racialized her as Black. And as such, ironically, they expect her to just fall in line and use the same lingo and have the same thoughts and all of this other stuff. And she's like, you know, I ask a question and I get accused of white splaining. And she's like, I never even heard that term until it was leveraged at me, and they're trying to prevent her tenure, the whole thing. And she said, you know, I want to know what people mean when they talk about equity all the time. And she's like, but as soon as you ask, you know, well, define equity, it's like, you know, you're demonized. And it makes me think about the fact of this realization that I have started to have about 6 months ago, which is that because we operate in the white and Black framework, many people do, it precludes us from thinking about it precludes us from asking ourselves those questions sometimes. And I think it lends to an unrealistic expectation and image of what a nation without racism looks like. And what I'm really thinking about is, let's take the idea of representation in the media or in different industries, right? There's this idea, I'm telling you, I saw an example of representation in whatever field. I can't recall exactly what it was, but let's just say in math, in economics, yeah. Right? And the caption on LinkedIn, it said 13% of these folks in economics are racialized Black people. And then it was like, I don't know, 50% racialized white, and then a mixed bag. And this is a travesty. And this is just evidence that we have so much more work to do. And I was doing the math. Speaking of economics, I was doing the math, and I was like, you know what? This proves my point that people don't get it. I think they've convinced themselves that equity looks like 50% racialized Black and then, you know, 20% white or something like that. But they're forgetting that 13% of the population is racialized Black people, and that includes children, retired people who aren't even in the workforce. And then never mind the fact that, you know, if you expect 13% everywhere, that would just be a super impossibility, because people choose different professions, different paths. They just have different paths. That forgets the fact that there's not even 13% of people in the workforce. And so they're looking at 13% like it's a loss, or they'll look at 8% like it's a loss, or 5%. And again, I'm like, but if we do the math, it's an impossibility to have equal numbers everywhere. It's a super impossibility to have the majority of racialized Black people seen everywhere, or people of color, if that's the goal, whatever the metric is. It's an impossibility. But people, you can't even ask the question, because you got to help people outside of the fishbowl. And I think that's one of the dangers of continuing to allow this ideology, this belief in race, to fester and persist, because it gives us these sort of impractical, unrealistic, impossible visions of what success looks like. And infrequently do we stop to consider, you know, what should success look like? What is my idea of success? What numbers do I think should be happening across the board, you know, and so on. And if it's something impossible to meet, if it's literally physically impossible to meet it, my God, well, we're going to stay in this fishbowl for all eternity. We will never transcend. And the last thing I want to say that people miss when I talk about stuff like this, liberating oneself from racism I'm not just talking about stopping racism at the core, although that's a critical part. My theory helps people get to the core problem of racism, which is the belief in race. But this also, as an individual, on an individual basis, it is absolutely freeing to see yourself outside the box racism creates for all of us. And it benefits every single person who's sick and tired of being sick and tired, because not only does it get you outside so that you stop internalizing racism when you experience it, or if you see it, but you stop seeing racism everywhere, because we're humans, we have eyeballs, many of us can see skin color. You stop translating that into race, which means you stop translating everything into racism, which means you're just more astute and clear-eyed about what's closer to reality. And that's a freeing thing, to stop internalizing it, to stop seeing it everywhere, to stop moving and being in the world in a way that is detrimental to your own psyche and well-being. And then that helps more people stop pass that trauma onto their kids. And there is value in that. Like, we have to help more people get to the other side of this thing, because it doesn't have to stay this way.
We've both been on Mark Lamont Hill's show, and even though he has his kind of perspective, I like that he's opening up his platform to a bunch of different viewpoints, and it challenges them and stuff like that. He had Chris Rufo on, who, look, I don't like the way that a lot of the anti-woke, I don't like the way that the woke are operating, but I don't like the way that a lot of the anti-woke are operating either. But the way that Chris Rufo was asked a question like, what do you like about being white? And he kind of said he rejects the question and stuff like that. And I addressed it on my Instagram about that, because I don't think of myself in those. I think of myself as other identity markers. I also mentioned that on the show. But like, my question is, do you want me to? Like, do you really want me to think of myself as white and my good things in my life, or because I'm like, I don't. Is that really what you want? Do you want me to identify as white and things like that? You know,
Yes.
you say that it's possible, and I really believe it's possible for racelessness. And here's why. I've taught in very diverse schools. I've been very lucky. I've been in LA. I was in like a really poor area of East LA that the principal opened a charter school, one of those last chance charter schools in Watts, and she said this place makes Watts look like Disneyland. Like, it was heartbreaking. The things that I had to witness were just horrible. And then now I teach at a private school adjacent to Beverly Hills, so I've seen it all. And you quickly get over what the kids look like. It's so fascinating. Like, I grew up in like a fairly white area of Pennsylvania, and I did my student teaching in Philadelphia. And I went in, the school was like 70% black or something. I walked in, I was like, "Ooh, that's a lot of black kids." And within the first like 3 days, I think, or something like that. Like, and I didn't say it like it was like a bad thing. It was just something new. And I had to be careful because, one day kids ran in, they go, Mr. Roosh, settle this. Who's more ashy, me or him? I was like, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Are you out of your minds? But then within like 3 days, I literally I forgot. And like, it was like 70% black and like whatever, like 30% Asian and Jewish, or Asian and white. And if you would ask me, like, give me a kid's name, I remember the kid. I have to like really pause and think, what was their race? And then I taught a school in LA. It was very, very diverse. And I was doing like some sort of game or something. And one of the girls said, what's the prize? And I said, it's Starburst. I was giving candy out. And she goes, Starburst? Oh, that's weak, Mr. Roosh. And I was like, what do you want? Like fried chicken or something like that? I was just saying in my head, just like I thought of a food. And she's like, oh, because I'm black? And I was like, damn it, Janessa, I forgot that you even weren't. Like, I'm sorry. Like, you know what I mean? Like that, I do believe that I'm in conversations with friends and I could say something that's racially insensitive sometimes. I really believe that you can look past skin color. You start to see people's personalities and souls and stuff like that. Maybe that's me being naive, but when I hear you, like, I go, this is possible. And for the people listening who say like, that's impossible, that you can't see their skin color. I actually talked to Brittany King about this. I don't think it's impossible. And maybe it's harder for some people than others, but I think it's possible. Does that, what I'm saying, make sense?
Yeah, I would just say that Yes, it makes sense. Absolutely. And that should be the goal. We should be centering our humanity. We're all human beings, whatever we look like or however we look, we're all human beings. And so that should definitely be the goal. And it happens more often than we would be led to believe. But I think what's important here is that it's not about not seeing a person's skin color. We should be able to see the skin color and just not translate it into all this other garbage.
The attachments that come with being that.
With being racialized, because the skin color itself isn't race, right? But we translate it into that. In the American context, we do. And that translation is the thing that's pernicious because race as a concept is the hierarchy more often than not. Sometimes it's the culture that we presume, or the ethnicity, but either way, that racialization, that act of racialization is limiting. And there are subconscious ways in which it can and ultimately will and often does influence how we think about, even if we don't act on it, how we think about ourselves and other people. And that's the kind of intervention that I'm advocating for here and committing my life's work to, is to help people stop that mistranslation, because kind of what you're describing is a sort of color blindness. And it's admirable, because any of us and all of us should want to be super aware of any potential biases, and we should not want those biases to creep into how we see other people, right, or how we treat them in particular. Absolutely. But I think part of the difference between colorblindness and my theory of racelessness necessitates the radical change in our belief system. I think racism is systemic because it's in our belief system. It's in our schools. It's how we teach. And that's not a new thing. That didn't just happen. We've always been taught race in very particular ways. And in that way, to have any meaningful change and to help more people transcend this thing and heal and unify and reconcile, we have to teach people that race is a fiction, that we should not be mistranslating things like skin color or hair texture or who our parents are, whatever, into race. And instead, we should kind of replace that incarceration, that limiting way of seeing ourselves and other people, with more generative understandings of humanity and culture and ethnicity. And in America, that means understanding that the term, it did once refer primarily to racialized white men. That's a historical fact. But then, women got the vote, racialized Black people were free, they got the vote, et cetera, et cetera. And slowly but surely in 2022, the context that once was, it's not the same anymore. And our language and keeping it the same. I have tracked the conceptualization of race across time and across countries. And we've kept the belief in race pretty much the same, even as little things have changed here and there. And that keeps us stuck in the 18th century. It just does. And it doesn't have to be that way. But if we keep doing it this way, if we keep teaching kids race, if we keep misdirecting the conversation about racism away from racism toward race, and if we keep insisting that we have to operate in the framework of race, then we will continue to reap what we sow. And I remember distinctly the moment with Christopher Rufo that you're mentioning when he was talking with Mark Lamont Hill. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, now there will be some people who proclaim that they are raceless, right? That they don't associate themselves with white. And the problem in the US is that this idea of racelessness keeps getting conflated and locked in with the category of whiteness. As such, freedom from racism also gets locked in with whiteness. Mm. So if you start to think about some of the common refrains that we hear in today's society about, white people can't experience racism, for example, that's coming from somewhere. It's not just people's foolishness and they don't know any better. the characteristics and values that have been assigned and conflated with the category of white and the category of black in particular, it keeps us in the same cycle of repeating and doing it all over again, and recycling and repeating and doing it all over again. So it makes sense how we've gotten here, and it makes sense that we're here. But what needs to happen, and what I hope I open the door to happen in more spaces than it would otherwise happen, is the recognition of how race has been and always will be a sort of metaphor for systems of power, and people respond accordingly within what they perceive to be these systems. And unfortunately, it's a time warp. It's like we're locked in a different century because we're using the same language. We're keeping the same characteristics locked with whiteness, the same characteristics locked with blackness, which defies reality because it's just not reality. It's just not. If we want to actually, if we're sincere about transcending racism and fighting against racism, being anti-racist, that is the lingo now. If we're sincere about that, then we have to examine why we continue to put racelessness and whiteness together, and to criticize moments like when Rufo says, I'm not white. And this idea, like, he's obviously said he's white before, so then he gets lambasted for that, as if people can't change, as if people can't grow, as if people can't learn, and get outside the fishbowl. And whether it's sincere or not, that's a separate issue. I think the fact that he demonstrated a willingness, even just in that moment, to not say, I'm a white man, Listen, I think we can do that. We should do that. And we can acknowledge the history. We can acknowledge the contemporary stuff, and we should. But we just can't do it in the same way.
I think of that Upton Sinclair quote about it's very difficult to get a man to believe something when his salary depends on him not believing it. And I think about DEI departments and stuff like that. I was talking to John Haidt, and he's like, I think that this woke stuff is going to be, kind of dissolving out. And I was like, John, you don't understand. These schools have entire DEI departments now, and those people have salaries. They're not, and it's almost like a lot of them, it's really cool to hear. It's encouraging to hear that your friend is, recognizing what's going on, and she's in the DEI, because that's rare. Most of them are like, cockroaches coming in to be the exterminators. And it seems like a mess. But, whether it's Kendi, and he's kind of lightning rod. I don't mean to just always throw him out there, but he puts himself out there. He wrote the book on anti-racism. But even something like, racializing, like who you choose in politics and all this kind of stuff. Even someone like Candace Owens, her thing is that she is a black woman and stuff like that. Like, it's very difficult. Sheena, you're up against quite a bit. You're trying to essentially change global culture. This is a global thing. This is a big thing. Now, there are pockets, I'm sure. I'm friends with Kimi Katiti, and when she was in Africa, she's just like, we didn't think about this because everyone was black, so we divided people differently and stuff like that. But you're up against a lot, and I worry that the biggest obstacle you're going to have is this maybe getting besides what I mentioned about people's salaries, is this getting politicized? If the right all of a sudden jumps all over this, Tucker Carlson brings you on a show because
bring me on your show.
Well, Anderson Cooper might not call you. That's the problem. Is Anderson Cooper's not going to call you, so Tucker Carlson, or Don Lemon's not going to call you, so Tucker Carlson does. And then before you know it, this becomes a Republican thing. And I don't know how you voted. I don't care. I feel like obligated to always say about how I've never voted Republican and stuff like that. But I shouldn't have to say that, but I do. And that's the thing. Have you found that your work is more received by people who get labeled? I mean, I get labeled alt-right, which is funny, but like, because I don't follow that narrative. But do you find that your ideas are more attractive to one side or the other politically, or that it's getting labeled that way? Because that's a concern of mine, because even medicine now is politicized. And then once like if Donald Trump would say, you know, Sheena Mason, I think your stuff's really good. You're screwed. You're screwed.
Listen, that's the one example where I might have to concede that, yes, if Donald Trump comes out and supports the theory of racistness, I am screwed.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. Or you could be like, maybe there's something off about my theory. What's going on?
You know what? Yeah, so that's a very fair concern and question, and one that I have been getting consistently from the outset. But the hilarious thing about it for me is the fact that people aren't doing that to my work. They're just not. They have the question, but nobody anywhere is like, oh, this is just a Republican thing, or Sheena's a conservative, or anything. People don't even. I find. Listen, I think it's in part a testament to my strength in communication, you know, and also a testament to my very well researched, you know, work and ideas. I think the people who get the most pushback are people who probably deserve it sometimes, because they don't have they just don't have the knowledge that is necessary to properly uphold their argument when you're talking with somebody who's probably, you know, inclined to disagree vehemently, right? People haven't been able to do that to me because I know what I'm talking about. Not for nothing, like the depth of my ideas and my knowledge are, I think, more and more apparent to people. And my forthcoming book will show just how deep this knowledge goes. I didn't just wake up one day and say, you know what? Theory of racistness, that sounds like a good idea. I'm going to circle all the channels. No, like this has been decades in the making. And it's staunchly nonpartisan, which I think matters because, you know, the politics of many other theory makers and frameworks and stuff like that are, you know, they don't hide their politics. And so I think that makes it so that their work does get politicized. It makes sense. You know, if I'm a Marxist or a socialist and I say that, you know, freely and I assert that, and then I create critical race theory or whatever, fill in the blank, then yeah, certain people with certain politics are going to take that work and hold it up as gospel, right? That makes sense. You can't do that with Sheena Mason's work because, you know, for what it's worth, I'm a registered independent. I vote for whoever I think has the best policies. And I tend to see the value in all of the things and from all different places and on the spectrum. And that prevents me from falling into the trap of looking at this as if, oh, this is a left-leaning thing or this is a right-leaning thing. No, this is something that benefits everyone that I hope everyone will listen to. That also means I don't prevent myself from working with and having conversations with people who identify in all different ways politically, because ultimately what would help the politicization of my work would be if I only talk to right-leaning folks, or, you know, like if I only work with right-leaning folks, which just isn't the case. And I'll say one last thing: people who are right-leaning engage with my work. Perhaps they engage with it more readily or more vocally because up front they hear me saying something that I'm not saying, but because they hear me saying something I'm not necessarily saying, they're like, oh yeah, I can get with this, right? But then they come in the door and they learn.
I'm sorry, Sheena. What do they hear you say that you're not saying?
I think sometimes they think it's colorblindness and that's attractive to them, but really when they stay long enough to learn from me, they recognize that, no, I'm saying you're wrong too, right? Yeah. It's just that because I do it from a place of racelessness and de-racializing people, they are more open to learning. They're open to being wrong about certain things. They're open to new ways of looking at it because they don't feel painted in a corner, right? Because that's not my MO. That's not my methodology. And so, yeah, I think because they kind of see it as almost immediately as a sort of colorblindness that's attractive to them, many of them, not all certainly. Yeah. And so they come in the door more readily and they stay long enough and they engage and they learn and they grow as human beings, and they're like, oh, actually what you're describing actually makes sense. It actually fits more of how I tend to see things, but I didn't have this, skepticism. I didn't have this eliminativism. I didn't have the language for it or the knowledge, but now I do. And so actually it's not colorblindness I'm aspiring to. Racelessness really fits that, right? It's like, okay, come in, find a home, right? And then people who lean left, I would say those are, it's pretty even split, because I am in university. I'm an assistant professor. I don't ask my students their politics, truth be told. But I get the general sense that the landscape at most universities tends to be more left than not, right? And sometimes that's readily apparent because students will speak their minds. They'll, talk against Trump or whatever. And so it'll be clear to me where they lean. And I find that those students might be hesitant at first, more hesitant than people who lean right. But they tell it to me this way: Professor, at first I thought you were crazy, but then the more I listened, the more I heard, and I realized you're just spitting facts. And now I can't possibly go back to looking at this thing the way that I did before I came into your classroom. They take my class again. Like I have many of my students from last semester, my first semester here, took classes with me this semester. Some took 2 classes with me again this semester. And I have plans to have some of those same students take a 3rd class with me next semester. They can't get enough because they tell me, wow, my classes are English literature. They're cross-listed in Africana and Latinx studies. And they tell me, well, in all of those other classes, in all of them, it's supposed to be, usually about resisting systems of oppression, yada, 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 but they all are saying the same thing. And initially I agreed with the thing that they're showing me because I want to be against racism or whatever, right? But then once I come in your door, I learned something that's in a lot of ways exact opposite of what they're showing me over there. And I can't go back. And and then they're kind of baffled, like, how come more people, aren't thinking this way, or how come more people don't have similar frameworks? And then they want to stay because they are freed. Honestly, they express that they are freed from some of the restrictions and the strictures that they felt that they were in before my classes. And that gives me insight into how this isn't a politics thing for people once they're engaged. Okay. And even people who might readily dismiss, they might hear the word racelessness and presume colorblindness, and if you lean left, that's a bad thing. Right. And they might just offhand, like, well, I'm not going to read that book or whatever the case. But I just find that that's increasingly not how people are approaching my work.
Good.
Which is a good thing, a good thing.
Well, marketing matters and stuff like that. But what you're doing really, I think what's resonating with young people is it's revolutionary. I know that term gets thrown around a lot, but it actually is. I mean, by like the core idea of what a revolution is. I mean, this is a major change. It sounds like you've arrived here you didn't intend to land here. You just landed here through your process. And I talk about in my classes about journalism and about science. And I said, if you're going in with saying narrative is the goal, this narrative to support this narrative, that's not science and that's not journalism. It's where you land when you go through the process is what it is. And it sounds like that's accurate. That's what you went through, right?
That's exactly right, because part of what I see happening with virtually everyone else, and part of what I discovered through my analysis of literary studies, because the body of African American literature continues to be defined as always having to do with race and racism, that's how the actual canon has been defined. People often come into classes or go into teaching the literature from that place, so that they're confirming their own biases, their own presuppositions about what the literature is going to show them, which keeps them in the quagmire and the same philosophies of race that are super limiting. And so my approach is basically, it is the exact opposite in some ways. It's a sort of 180, because I come and I teach my students the core tenets. I'm very transparent. They know about the business. They know about the book. They know about the theory. I teach them the tenets. I teach them the philosophies of race. And then I say, okay, now we're going to analyze some of the literature, because, I can't get away from teaching some of the canonized stuff. But to mix it up, I'm going to teach you some of the uncanonized stuff too. Right. And we're going to examine with a critical eye how this narrative of racism, African-American literature always having to do with it, Blackness, all that stuff. We're going to examine it with a critical eye. And so that they're doing the work for themselves and they're coming to discovery for themselves in the same way that I did. But they also have somebody who's opening the door for them sooner than anyone ever did for me, because I was constantly, because the work has been defined in those ways, and because race ideology works in the ways that it does, I was more often than not coming up against people who, because they agreed with the narrative, or because they agreed with how the body of work is defined, how Blackness is defined, etc., they had a hard time seeing things any other way. They would only ever interpret it in a way that upheld the narrative. And I mean, racism is one topic, but I'm sure this happens across the board with a variety of things. If you believe a certain thing and you approach something looking for that thing, then you're going to confirm your own biases, right? And so it's like just being able to help present an alternative, and watching my students on a regular basis like explore that and feel that for themselves. I'm telling you, I am privileged and honored and blessed, and I hope that anything of what I say and podcasts and radio and TV in my book will help other people feel inspired to do this differently. Because the worst thing we can do for our society is to teach our young people, our youth, to keep doing this the same way, and in fact to double down and triple down. There is an alternative. We don't have to do it the same way anymore.
Yes, you are up against so much, and yet I think when you sit down, like you said, and you talk to people, I think nearly anyone who's reasonable and not completely corrupted by ideology will latch on. You talk to people, I'm going to talk to people about this stuff, and I have, and like, it's like, oh yeah. But you teach me a lot, even in this conversation, like the separation of colorblindness and racelessness. That's really important. I got to be more articulate when I explain that. Like, my kids will describe other kids and stuff like that. They just don't care. They don't attach anything because they haven't been pushed that racialized narrative and things like that. Tell us about, your book. There's a release date. I know you were getting some like flack on Twitter for the price, which is out of your control. But it's an academic book. That was funny to see. People are like, oh, geez. But where can people follow? We did an hour already, and I hope that we can continue conversations any way I can add fuel to your fire. Like, Sheena, I'm in. This is the ideal that I want my kids who are they're biracial, but like, we don't talk about that. We just say, your mama came from here and dada came from here, and it's like cool and it's all good, blah, blah, blah. But like, we really are trying to steer them away from like that racialized, like, because you're this, then you have to be this type of stuff. It's the future I want for my kids. And even though you're up against a lot, I think a lot of people, if they're given the opportunity to consume it and process it, I think across a lot of lines, people will go, that's the ideal. That's what we're going for. So where can people follow you, get your stuff, get your book, all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, thank you, Will. You're exactly right. I'm glad you see it that way. You're exactly right. The biggest pushback I get are from the people that are so far on the poles of the spectrums on either side that they're calling me a white supremacist and a coon, or they're calling me the N-word and a B word. It's like, and it's so clear that those people are not my audience, and it's clear that they're not reasonable. But I think, for what it's worth, it's a very small minority of people who respond in that way. I always say 9 out of 10 people are like, oh yeah, this makes sense.
Yeah.
So people can connect with me and find me at theoryofracelessness.org, step number 1. My podcast, my publications, like news articles and things of that nature are linked on the website, as well as my Twitter. So that's a really good starting point. And then outside of that, I'm on Twitter, Sheena Mason PhD, at Sheena Mason PhD. And then the book is on Amazon. If you search Theory of Racelessness on Amazon, it pops up right away. And I'm happy to report that this is a very, the book doesn't release till September 23rd, 2022. So we're a few months away. Mm-hmm. And people are already buying it, even though there are some people griping about the cost. It is an academic text. It is, I present my theory of racelessness for the first time in a cogent manner, and define it and lay it all out. And then I apply it to African-American literary studies as a case study to demonstrate what it is I'm talking about, and what that all that is generative that can come from doing this a different way. And I invite a broader audience in through the introductory chapter and the conclusion, of course, because, in case you haven't noticed, this belief in race is really all consuming in most aspects of American life. And so the applicability of the theory is really unlimited in a lot of ways. So I encourage and invite people to definitely check out those different resources. And also know that I am working on a second book for a broader audience that will be at a different price point. Yeah. And I'm hoping to get that out in the next year.
Yeah, I think that'd be good. Something that's like maybe more easily consumable for people who aren't in the academics. Dr. Mason, one of my favorite Teddy Roosevelt quotes is, "Far and away the best prize that life has to offer is a chance to work hard at work worth doing." And I hope that I think you do, but I just want to reiterate, like, what you're doing really is important. And I'm not just, just being obsequious or blowing smoke up your butt. Like, it seems like it's really worth doing. It's awesome. I'm behind it. Thank you for coming on the show. I hope that the audience resonates with this and it just gives a little spark and they go, all right, I'm going to pursue a little bit further, and they start to consume your stuff. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will. I appreciate it.
Okay. Take care.